The Gilgo Beach serial killings were a series of murders spanning from the early 1990s until 2011. Many of the victims' remains were found over a period of months in 2010 and 2011 during a police search of the area along Ocean Parkway near the remote beach town of Gilgo in Suffolk County, New York. The search was prompted by the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, who, like many of the known victims, worked as an escort and advertised on Craigslist. The perpetrator in the case is known as the Long Island serial killer, LISK for short, the Manorville Butcher, or the Craigslist Ripper. The victims were predominantly women, many of whom had been involved in prostitution or the sex trade, which has made some people question whether the killer specifically targeted vulnerable individuals whom he believed wouldn't be missed. Some of the women had been reported missing, while others were never fully identified until later investigations. The most significant and high-profile victim in the case was Shannon Gilbert, whose disappearance in 2010 led to the discovery of the bodies. Shannon had been working as an escort in Manhattan and was last seen in Oak Beach, Long Island, where she had arranged to meet a client. Shannon's frantic 911 call, made just before she disappeared, was one of the few pieces of evidence that offered clues into the killer's behavior. In the call, Shannon can be heard screaming, "They're trying to kill me," and sounding panicked, but the call abruptly ends, and she was never seen alive again. Her body was found in December 2011, about a mile away from where the other victims were discovered, though her cause of death was initially thought to be drowning. However, the 911 call and other factors led investigators to believe that she may have been fleeing from the killer. Other victims included Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, and Melissa Barthélemy, all of whom were involved in the sex trade and had disappeared from the same general area of Long Island between 2007 and 2010. Their remains were found in similar conditions, reinforcing the theory that these murders were linked. The case initially stumped law enforcement. The discovery of so many bodies in such a short span led authorities to believe they were dealing with a serial killer. Over the years, investigators tried various avenues, including conducting DNA tests and re-examining the evidence for new clues. They also looked at the possibility that the killer was local, given the knowledge of the isolated areas where the bodies were dumped. One of the major challenges for the police was the lack of physical evidence. There were no clear DNA matches between the victims and any suspects, and the killer seemed to take great care in concealing his identity. The similarities in the way the bodies were disposed of, wrapped in burlap sacks, suggested that the killer was methodical and possibly had a background in either law enforcement or another profession where such attention to detail was common. The killer's behavior suggested he may have been familiar with the areas where the bodies were found, and investigators even speculated that he might have lived near the crime scenes. Despite multiple attempts to identify a suspect, the case remained unsolved for many years. On December 10, 2015, Suffolk County Police Commissioner Tim Sinney announced that the FBI had officially joined the investigation. The announcement came one day after former police chief James Burke was indicted for civil rights violations and conspiracy. Burke, who resigned from the department in October 2015, was reported to have blocked FBI involvement in the Gilgo Beach cases for years. The FBI had previously assisted in the search for victims but had never officially been a part of the investigation. In November 2016, Burke was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for assault and conspiracy. There was considerable other interagency friction and failures to cooperate in law enforcement that hindered the investigation over the years. In 2020, Suffolk County Police released images of a belt found near Ocean Parkway in Gilgo Beach, which had the letters HM or WH embossed on it. The belt was believed to have been handled by the perpetrator, though it did not belong to any of the victims. This evidence, along with new scientific methods, was part of an ongoing investigation that also included the launch of GilgoNews.com to receive tips. In 2019, it was proposed to use genealogy to identify the victims and possibly the killer. By May 2020, Jane Doe number 6 inches was identified as Valerie Mack, also known as Melissa Taylor, and Jane Doe number 7 inches was identified as Karen Vergata in 2023. A person of interest in the case was John Bitroff, a convicted murderer of 2 sex workers and a suspect in a third. His DNA was found on the bodies of victims from 1993 and 1994. Bitroff, a carpenter with tools commonly used for dismemberment, lived in Manorville, about 30 miles from the Gilgo Beach victims' remains. His connection to some of the Gilgo Beach cases was noted, especially since one of the victims, Melissa Barthelemy, had frequent phone calls to Manorville before her death. Bitroff's involvement in the Gilgo Beach murders is still under investigation. In July 2023, Rex Andrew Hoyerman, a 59-year-old architect from Nassau County, was arrested and charged with the murders of Melissa Barthelemy, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello. He was later named the prime suspect in the death of Maureen Brainerd Barnes, and in January 2024, he was charged with her murder. In June 2024, Hoyerman was also arraigned for the murders of Jessica Taylor and Sandra Castilla, with Castilla's murder previously not linked to the Gilgo Beach killings. On December 17, 2024, he was indicted for the 2000 murder of Valerie Mack. Hoyerman has pleaded not guilty to all charges. Authorities began considering Hoyerman as a suspect in March 2022, after his Chevrolet Avalanche was linked to the crime scene, and cell phone records showed contact with 3 of the victims. Further evidence included online searches linked to Hoyerman for sadistic materials, child pornography, and images of the victims and their families. Mitochondrial DNA testing from a pizza crust discarded by Hoyerman potentially matched DNA found on one of the victims, and hair samples from the victims were also linked to Hoyerman's wife. Investigators confirmed that Hoyerman's wife and children were out of state during the killings. My father-in-law was a U.S. Marshal back in the day. I sometimes joke that he used to hunt people for a living, but as he's corrected me on more than one occasion, it's more like he used to hunt the people who hunt people. The people hunter, if you will. And he's told me some pretty wild stories, especially around Christmas and Thanksgiving. The kind he only tells late at night after a few bottles of beer, and when all those with more sensitive ears have retired upstairs to go to sleep. And most of them are war stories, pretty great ones, make no mistake, but a lot of drive, shoot, arrest the bad guys, then home in time for pot roast and pie, as they say. But there was one story he told me that I haven't really been able to shake, and I'd like to share it with you. They've been tracking this one fugitive for months all across the country when they suddenly got an eyewitness sighting of the guy at a Bible school out in rural Ohio, under the assumption that he was living under a false identity. My father-in-law and his partner drove out to a place to talk to the school's principal. They seem like real nice folks out there, a little naive, but warm enough. And at first it seemed like they were doing their best to cooperate. But as time went by, it became more and more obvious that not only were the Bible school's staff and principal elaborately stonewalling them, but the place was much more than just a Bible school. The reason why an Ohio Bible school was so focused to shield a violent fugitive is that it was a cult, and I use the word cult very loosely, because I feel like that suggests a bunch of weird, naked rituals involving black magic where maybe Tom Cruise makes an appearance or something. I don't know, that's an Eyes Wide Shut reference, you can't sue me for that. But what this place was just very close-knit, a Christian community that believed in absolute forgiveness and were willing to put themselves on the line for each other. They were smart enough not to make it obvious that they were aiding and abetting a criminal. But at the same time, it's no coincidence that their person of interest was never around. When, whether the marshals stopped by, things got more and more tense as time went by. 2. My father-in-law and his partner kept on coming back day after day, making it clear that they weren't going anywhere until they got a sit-down interview with the man they believed was their fugitive. Eventually, the school's principal snaps at the marshals and tells them to come back with a warrant or not at all. Well, they went and got themselves a warrant. And then they came back with uniformed officers too, just in case the students put up any resistance. And according to my father-in-law, the school was set up as 4 buildings with a field and meeting square in the center of them. Then, as the marshals in their uniformed accompaniment walk onto the property, students start walking out of the building to give them death stares, including the principal. My father-in-law and the uniforms are walking slightly behind, and they see the kid before his partner does. So, as soon as this 18 or 19-year-old kid starts to approach with a face like thunder, everyone starts telling him to stay where he is and to not come any closer. Seeing as this kid appears to be unarmed and looks to be about $1 and change soaking wet. They're all very casual about their commands. But as soon as he gets closer and closer, they start taking out their weapons and issuing the commands more seriously. But then, the second they do, the kid just rushes them. He sprints towards my father-in-law's partner, but no one's shooting him because they don't want a scandal on their hands, and they're not really sure what to do in that moment. My father-in-law said that he could see the headlines already Feds raid, Bible school, 1 innocent student slain, and things of that nature. He knew. Pulling the trigger might kill his career before it had ever really started, so he chose not to, but he then spent the rest of his career wishing he had. I guess his partner ended up wishing that he shot the kid too, but he didn't. And instead, he got ready to receive his weak tackle so he could wrestle him to the dirt and put him in cuffs. But the kid didn't try and tackle him so much as he just walked up and hugged him. With his big old smile on his face instead of a frown, the kid must have been much stronger than he looked. Because when he clamped himself onto my father-in-law's partner, he started legitimately struggling to get him off. Now, my father-in-law in the uniform start walking over to lend a hand, lowering their weapons because the kid's got a screw loose, but he doesn't seem dangerous, but he was dangerous. They just didn't realize it until they saw what he had in his hands. My father-in-law's partner didn't see it, because obviously the kid's hands were way around his back, but the others did, and when they saw it, they practically threw themselves backwards in an attempt to put whatever distance they could between my father-in-law's partner, the kid, and what the kid had in his hands, which, to their absolute shock and horror, was a goddamned hand grenade. And it must have only been a matter of seconds between the time they spotted the grenade and when it actually exploded. And when it did, it tore both men apart. And what followed was pure chaos. Everyone pointing guns at the students standing by the buildings all the while, backing up toward the way they came in. Because of the layout of the buildings at the school, they were in the perfect place for an ambush. After a bunch of backup arrived, the cops turned the whole place inside out, looking for weapons, drugs, anything they could use to start locking people up. But they didn't find their fugitive, and it took another year before the marshals were able to track him down again. And when they did, he'd set himself up in yet another Bible school. Only this one was up in the middle of nowhere. Alaska, the guy was halfway into talking, the students into defending him with their lives again when the marshals finally got their hands on him. In that time, their play was a lot smarter and a lot more subtle. My father-in-law got to question him. At one point, it was little more than a favor granted, after losing his partner in such a way. But when he did, he said he got chills from just maintaining eye contact with the guy. He said he was the most charming, personable individual he'd ever come across, the kind of guy that could sell sand to the Arabs and snow to the Eskimos, he said, after talking to the guy for more than 10 to 15 minutes. He understood how he might be able to convince someone to blow themselves up, just to defend him. He said he felt that he was reading him. Not like a book, either. Those take time, my father-in-law said. The guy read him like a stop sign. One look, and he knew all he needed to know. One look, and he knew exactly how to talk to my father-in-law to get him to lower his defenses, so to speak. He said he never fell under that guy's spell or anything like that. He knew the fugitive was a master manipulator just from the interviews they'd conducted with the Bible school students, so he had it in the front of his mind the whole time that the guy was trying to win him over. But he also said that by the time 10 to 15 minutes had elapsed, he'd never felt so uncomfortable sitting in the same room as a suspect. Then he did that day. He'd sat in the same room as mass murderers, people who hurt children, people, smugglers, all kinds of hardcore scumbags. But sitting across from those guys, you knew what they were because they couldn't hide what they were. Whereas with the Bible school fugitive, it was like he could change his face depending on who he was talking to. My father-in-law said the guy ended up going to federal prison for his original crime, which I guess was some kind of financial fraud. I'm not sure of exactly what it was, but even combined with all the charges relating to him absconding from the law, his sentence didn't even top 15 years. My father-in-law knew the guy would probably get out of there before that too. And the idea of having someone like that back on the street was terrifying to him. He said he was the scariest son of a he'd ever had the displeasure of coming across. And what scared him the most is that it was only a matter of time before he was back out there getting up to his old tricks again. And when that happened, he had no doubt that people were going to die. This next story is deeply, deeply disturbing. 45 minutes away from midnight on January 16th of 1936, the chaplain of New York's Sing Sing maximum security prison walked down a long, quiet corridor toward a stark, isolated cell inside a condemned prisoner. Bound for the electric chair as being shaved, a guard gently rakes Aerosol blade over the final few patches of stubble on his scalp, then unceremoniously repeats the process. On the prisoner's legs, when it's time the prisoner is led from his cell to his execution, chamber the grim. Silence broken only by the whispered prayers of the prison. Chaplain inside the cham. The dark silhouette of the iconic electric chair is suddenly illuminated as a guard flicks on the lights. The condemned is then guided to the chair, its leather straps tightened around their arms, legs, and chest. Amos and Sponge is placed under a metal skull cap on their shaved head. Another electrode is secured to the bare patch of flesh on their freshly shaven leg. Once he's secured, the guard pulls back a pair of dark curtains revealing an observation room filled with journalists, officials, and relatives of the condemned's departed victims. Their faces are a mix of steely resolve and silent dread when asked if he has any last words. The condemned simply mutters, "I don't even know why." I'm here the guards who, by that point, had spent almost a year enduring his continual imprisonment were somewhat underwhelmed by their charge's final limp statement. One of them turns to the condemned's attorney, a man named James Dempsey. He is in possession of several pages of handwritten notes penned by his client in the final few hours before his execution. The guard asked Dempsey to reveal the contents of the notes, and Dempsey's reply is curt. "I will never show those letters to anyone." He says, the most filthy, stomach-churning string of obscenities I have ever, Red, you see, the man in the electric chair is no ordinary prisoner, in fact. He's one of the most frighteningly deranged serial predators in American history. The media has dubbed him the Grey Man, the werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire. But his real name is Albert Fish. Fish was born Hamilton House Fish in Washington, D.C. on May 19th of 1870. He was his parents' youngest child, conceived when his father was 74 years old, and was born into a family plagued by serious mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. One of his brothers was confined to a state mental hospital, while his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction at a young age. 3 other relatives were eventually diagnosed with mental illnesses, while his own mother was set to suffer auditory and/or visual hallucinations, tragically on October 16th of 1875. Albert's father suffered a fatal heart attack while at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. Randall Fish was the glue which held the family together, so believing herself unfit to care for him, little Albert's mother sent him to D.C.'s St. John's Orphanage. Corporal punishment was riff of the orphanage, and it was here that a young Albert first began to develop an intense paraphilia associated with pain and suffering. Whenever a child ed or stepped out of line, one of the orphanage's staff would beat them mercilessly. Many adapted by becoming disturbingly institutionalized. Others lost their minds completely. Little Albert, on the other hand, adapted his psyche to the point that he enjoyed the pain induced by the corrective beatings. He lived that way for 5 long years, and then following a successful course of psychiatric treatment, Albert's mother landed herself a job working for the federal government and was able to remove him from care. But in 1880, when she finally retrieved her now 10-year-old son, he was not how she remembered him growing up. Albert's mother called him Ham, while his friends affectionately referred to him as Ham and Eggs. But upon his release from St. John's Orphanage, he informed his mother that he wished to be known as Albert. And this seemingly innocuous declaration might seem insignificant at first, but it chilled little Albert's mother to her core. Herson had not picked the name Albert at random. In fact, it had belonged to a brother of his that had passed away during infancy. The desire to be named after his deceased sibling was probably the most profound manifestation of young Albert's deep-seated mental illness. But as he grew older, his symptoms would grow considerably more disturbing in 1882. A 12-year-old Albert made friends with a local telegraph boy, who apparently was just as disturbed after realizing Albert was easily manipulated, or perhaps due to a predilection of his own. The young boy introduced young Albert to the practice of drinking one's own urine and consuming one's own feces. It's believed such hideous acts are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg when it comes to their stomach-churning recreation. And over the years that followed, Albert sank deeper and deeper into depravity. By the time he was a teenager, Albert had taken to visiting public bathhouses, but instead of spending his time bathing, spritzing, or lounging in the steam room, Albert would linger in the changing area, watching as the other boys undressed. The ritual remained a lingering preoccupation for Albert, who'd spent most week haunting bathhouse, changing areas, and drawing suspicious stares. But over time, he began partaking in other hobbies, such as anonymously writing threatening or obscene correspondence to women whose names and addresses he acquired from newspaper ads. Albert continued living in D.C. until early 1890, when he made one of the most significant decisions of his entire life. He packed his bags, said goodbye to his mother and siblings, and then bought a one-way ticket to New York City upon his arrival in the Big Apple. A now 20-year-old Albert, quickly exhausted. His meager savings, he began engaging in prostitution, and is believed to have groomed and molested several neighborhood children, mostly boys under the age of 6. He stayed in touch with his mother Ellen, who doted on her youngest child, but she was nevertheless concerned over her son's financial and matrimonial stagnation. So in 1898, when Albert was in his late 20s, his mother arranged his marriage to 19-year-old Anna Hoffman, a friend's daughter, and they went on to have 6 children over the course of 5 years. But the financial strain forced Albert into criminality to make ends meet. It proved unsustainable. And in 1903, Albert was arrested, convicted of grand larceny, and incarcerated in Sing Sing prison upon his release. Fish was a changed man. His interest in family life dwindled, and he spent considerably more time pursuing acts of want and debauchery. In one instance, he and a male lover attended a waxwork exhibition at a New York museum. And it was here that Fish became obsessed with mutilation, following an encounter with a wax bisection of a human penis. He became entranced with the biomechanical marvel that constitutes the human body. But unlike many of us whose interests spark joy or constitute a positive intellectual pursuit, Albert's new fixation was far from healthy. Several years later, around the year 1910, Fish was working in Wilmington, Delaware, when he met 19-year-old Thomas Bann. Having deduced that Bann was a homosexual, Fish began pursuing him. But rather than fostering a romantic relationship, theirs was based in a deeply unsettling variety of violent SED masochist. And once he'd fully gained his trust, Fish invited Bann to join him in an old farmhouse. The implication being that they'd have a quiet, secluded spot in which to make love. But in meeting him there and allowing Fish to bind and restrain him, Thomas Bann made the last and largest mistake of his life over the next 2 weeks. Albert Fish relentlessly tortured his hapless young captive, who apparently suffered from some variety of mental disability. Bann was beaten, burned, flayed, and starved, before finally Fish took a sharpened straight razor and castrated his screaming prisoner. I shall never forget his scream, with the look he gave me. He later said, having harbored an initial desire to murder B, and once he was done with him, it appears that when it came time to do the deed, Fish had a sudden change of heart. Since it was high summer, he feared the stench of Bond's decomposing corpse would draw attention to him during its transportation, but it's also possible that Fish simply felt merciful toward a young man he'd already subjected to unimaginable anguish. And so instead of killing him, Fish poured peroxide over the wound where Benin's genitals used to be, and then wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief. Fish then slipped a $10 bill into Bann's clothes, gave him one final kiss, and then slipped out of the barn and departed. I took the first train I could to get back home. Fish later said, but I never heard what became of that boy, and I never tried to find out. In January of 1917, Fish's wife finally grew tired of his bizarre and secretive lifestyle and divorced him before moving in with a local handyman. Fish later claimed that she took every possession the family owned. And while it's unclear if this is true, we know for certain that the divorce had a devastating effect on his psyche. He began to suffer the same auditory hallucinations his mother once had, and once found walking down a New York street wrapped in a carpet, while loudly declaring himself an acolyte of John the Baptist. It was also around this time the Fish began driving steel needles into the flesh of his groin and abdomen. It's unclear if he considered this a form of religious flagellation, but following his eventual arrest, X-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles embedded in his pelvic region. Fish would also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool DST with lighter fluid into the cavities of his body, before setting it to light. Following the mental breakdown caused by the failure of his marriage, Fish's mental health continued to slowly deteriorate. He became increasingly erratic and violent, until one day while on a visit to Georgetown in the year 1919, Fish found himself gripped by the overwhelming urge to stab a complete stranger. The person he chose at random turned out to be an intellectually disabled boy. Fish walked up to him, drove a knife into his chest again and again and again, then simply walked back to his car and drove away. It marked the first time Fish had attacked someone with the intention of ending their life. And although the fate of his victim remains unknown, the incident proved a watershed moment in Albert's lifelong pursuit of depravity on July 11th of 1921. Fish spotted 8-year-old Beatrix Keel playing alone at her parents' farm on Staten Island, New York. He approached the girl offering her money in exchange for her help. Picking rhubarb, the girl accepted his invitation and was just about to depart with him before her mother caught wind of what was happening and chased Fish away. Incredible. L. Fish later returned to the Kells farm and attempted to sleep overnight in their barn. But thankfully, he was quickly discovered by the family patriarch Hans Keel, who ordered him to leave under pain of death. Yet Fish remained undeterred, and by 1924 he was suffering from a deeply deranged form of psychosis, and believed none other than God Almighty was commanding him to commit unspeakable acts of violence and cruelty against children. 1928, a 58-year-old Albert Fish began to assemble what he referred to as his 10 implements of hell. These consisted of a meat cleaver, a butcher's knife, a small handa, thumbscrews, needles, a whip, a studded paddle, razor blades, a hammer, and a length of rope. It was essentially a murder kit, with each item having been selected for a very specific purpose. The cleaver and handsaw, for example, were used for dismemberment, while the thumbscrews, whip, and studded paddle were tools of torture. The needles, on the other hand, well, they were for Fish's own personal satisfaction, and the method of insertion was one he could use to turfy his hapless victims. It said, "If I'll do this to myself, imagine what I'm going to do to you." Sometime in the spring of 1928, Fish attempted to test his 10 implements on 10-year-old Syl. Quinn, Fish had been grooming and molesting little Syl, and sadly had managed to firmly win the boy's trust. So when Fish discovered Sorrel and a friend of his playing box ball on the sidewalk one day and asked if they'd like to join him at his apartment for sandwiches, they followed without question as Fish prepared their lunch. The two boys were supposedly wrestling on his bed when suddenly one of them dislodged his mattress, revealing several sharp tools, which comprised Fish's 10 implements of hell. Frightened and confused as to why Fish had such implements concealed under his bed, Sorrel and his friend ran from the apartment, and it was only much later that they discovered just how lucky they'd really been. Just months later, on May 25th of 1928, Fish saw an advertisement in the Sunday edition of the New York World. It read, "Young man, 18, wishes for a position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street." 3 days later, Fish paid a visit to the Budd family's Manhattan home. Under the pretense of hiring young Edward as a farm laborer after introducing himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from upstate New York, he offered work to both Edward and a neighborhood friend of his, then said he'd return in a few days to collect them. Fish stayed true to his word, but upon his return he met another member of the Budd family, and his bloodthirsty scheme changed significantly. Fish's original plan was to drive 18-year-old Edward out into the middle of nowhere, where he would blind torture and murder him. But after returning to the Budd family home and knocking on the door, it was answered by Ed's younger sister, 10-year-old Gracie Fish, was instantly and uncontrollably obsessed with the girl. And somehow he managed to convince Gracie's parents to grant him permission to take her to a children's birthday party that was supposedly taking place that afternoon. Unbelievably, Albert and Delia Budd handed over their daughter to an almost total stranger, one who would go on to rank among the most sadistic serial murderers of the 20th century. And needless to say, they never saw her again. Fish subsequently drove Gracie to an abandoned house he had previously scouted low at 359 Mountain Road in the neighborhood of Irvington, Wisteria. Cottage had been falling down for quite some time. Fish led Gracie into the house, assuring her the party was inside, and when she became upset, he strangled her. Unconscious, cut off her head, then butchered her body, much in the way a hunter would a deer. He drained the girl's blood, skinned her, then dead her corpse before dividing individual portions into cuts, such as stack and roast fish, then wrapped each piece of little Gracie's butchered body, froze them, then consumed them. Over the course of the next several weeks, just over 3 months later, on September 5th of 1930, Fish watched with glee as police announced the arrest of 66-year-old Charles Edward Pope on suspicion of Gracie's murder and the aftermath of the child's disappearance. Pope's estranged wife had approached law enforcement claiming her husband was the guilty party. She gave a detailed account of strange new behaviors, along with nocturnal outings that went unexplained, and it was a complete fabrication. Pope was arrested, then prior to his eventual trial in December of 1930. He spent more than 100 days remanded in jail before being found not guilty. There hadn't been a single shred of evidence deemed worthy of convicting Charles Pope, while the real killer remained at large 4 years later. Gracie Budd's mother, who by then was living as Delia Flanagan, found a letter in her family's mailbox. Since Delia was functionally illiterate, she opened the letter, gave it to her son, then asked him to read it aloud to her. And with only minor changes for the purpose of clarity and decency, the letter read as follows. "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer. Tomb, his name was Captain John Davis, has sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went to shore and got drunk. And when they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was famine in China. Meat of any kind cost anywhere from $1 to $3 a pound. And so great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street, and you could go in any shop and ask for steak chops or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and they would give you what you wanted, cut from it a boy or girls, behind which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold his V cutlet brought the highest price. Captain John stayed there so long that he acquired a taste for human flesh. Then on his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one aged 7 and the other aged 11. He took them to his home, stripped them naked, and tied them up before throwing them in a closet. He burned everything they were wearing. Then, several times a day, he spanked them, tortured them to make their meat good and tender. First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest behind, and of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except the head bones and guts. He was roasted in the oven, boiled, broiled, fried, and stewed. The smaller boy was next. He went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, and when Captain John told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it on Sunday. June the 3rd of 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. I brought you pot, cheese, and strawberries. We had lunch. But when Grace sat in my lap and kissed me, I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said, yeah, she can go. Remember, I took her to an empty house in Westchester. I had already picked out when we got there. I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers while I went upstairs and stripped all of my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. And when all was ready, I went to the window and called her, and then hid in the closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her. She said she would tell her mama first. I stripped her naked, how she did kick, bite, and scratch. I then choked her to death and cut her into small pieces so I could cook and eat them. How sweet and tender she was after being roasted in the oven. It took me 9 whole days to eat her entire body. I did not do anything terrible to her, though I could have. I wished she did die a virgin. It's unlikely that Gracie's brother ever made it through the entire letter. But what's certain is that it caused unimaginable heartache for her still grieving family. Police quickly determined that although the story concerning the cannibal captain and the famine in Hong Kong could not be verified, the section of the letter concerning the murder of Gracie was found to be accurate in both its description of the kidnapping as well as the events which followed. Whether or not her corpse had been cannibalized remained to be seen. But when police announced that the letter was genuine, they did so with a killing degree of certainty. It was a knife in the gut for the Budd family, but in a poetic twist, Fish's attempt to mock the heartbroken mother of his young victim sowed the seeds of his eventual undoing. The letter was delivered in an envelope bearing a small hexagonal symbol, along with the letters NIPCBA. The acronym stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. And following a public plea for information, police were approached by one of the company's janitors. This janitor sheepishly admitted that he'd taken some of the company's stationery home, but had left it at his 52nd Street rooming house when he moved out. Police then approached the property's landlady and asked her to provide the name of the room's current tenant. She told them the room was now vacant, but that its former occupant had moved out just a few days earlier. His name was Albert Fish. After learning that Fish had set to return to the 52nd Street rooming house, Detective William King, the chief investigator on the case, waited outside the room when she showed up. Fish seemed innocently surprised at the presence of law enforcement and agreed to a voluntary interview if he could only deposit his bags in his room. King obliged him, and Fish repaid him by attempting to take a razor blade to the detective's throat. Following a brief but violent struggle, Fish was subdued by the furious detective, who ordered uniformed officers to drag him off the police headquarters. There, Fish made no attempt to deny the murder of Gracie Budd, and stated that he originally intended to kill her brother Edward. After being remanded in custody, Fish was accused of several other similarly bloodthirsty crimes, including the murder of 9-year-old Frances McDonnell. Frances was reported missing on the night of July 14, 1924, after he failed to return home. After playing catch with friends in Port Richmond, Staten Island, a search was organized with both police and civilian volunteers, scour in the surrounding area for any sign of the missing Frances. It wasn't long before they found him in a wooded area just a few hundred yards from his childhood bedroom. Little Frances McDonnell was found hanging from a tree branch, having been violated and then strangled with his own suspenders. Frances had also suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had been almost entirely stripped of flesh. When confronted, Fish vehemently denied any involvement in Frances' murder. He admitted to being in the area of Port Richmond on the date in question. He even admitted having considered Frances a potential victim. But according to Fish, when he suddenly felt the urge to violate the boy, he claimed a stranger approached, and he was forced to flee the area. He couldn't explain why Frances's friends claimed he'd been taken by an, I quote, an elderly man with a gray mustache, and they weren't the only ones to spot a man fitting Fish's description when questioned. Frances's mother claimed she'd spotted a man fitting Fish's description on the day her son was murdered. She told reporters he came shuffling down the street, mumbling to himself and making strange motions with his hands. I saw his thick gray hair and his drooping gray mustache. Everything about him seemed faded and gray. And this is when the media began circulating Fish's chilling mon, her of the Guy man, shortly after Anna made her statements to the press. None other than Staten Island farmer Hans Keel, who, if you remember, had once chased Fish out of his family. Barn approached law enforcement to give a full and frank statement regarding Fish's historical criminality. He had no doubt in his mind that Fish was the guilty party, and his staunch conviction inspired the Richmond County District Attorney to seek an indictment against Fish for Frances's murder. And finally, in March of 1935, just 10 months before the date of his execution, Albert Fish confessed to 9-year-old Frances McDonnell's violation and murder, prompting the New York Daily Mirror to dub him the most vicious child slayer in criminal history. Following the McDonald confession, Fish was questioned in connection with the disappearance of Albert Fish, a notorious serial killer, is associated with the chilling disappearance of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in 1927. Billy had been playing with his older brother and a friend, Billy Beaton, outside their apartment in Brooklyn when both Billy Gaffney and Billy Beaton vanished. After a search, Beaton was found hiding in an alcove on the building's roof, terrified. When asked about Billy Gaffney's whereabouts, Beaton gave a haunting response. The boogeyman took him. In the aftermath, authorities suspected Albert Fish, a convicted serial killer who had a disturbing history of child murders. A motorman on a Brooklyn trolley recalled seeing an elderly man whom he later identified as Fish, attempting to silence a crying child on the same day Billy Gaffney disappeared. Fish had dragged the child off the trolley with violent force, alarming passengers. Further investigation revealed that Fish had been employed as a house painter in Brooklyn around the time of Gaffney's disappearance, and his work location was close to the area where the boy had been abducted. However, there was no immediate proof linking Fish to the crime. It wasn't until a letter from Fish surfaced that the true horror of his actions came to light. The letter detailed his abduction, torture, and murder of Billy Gaffney. Fish described in disturbing detail how he had stripped the boy, tied him up, and subjected him to unspeakable horrors before killing him. He also recounted how he had cooked and eaten parts of the boy's body, finding particular satisfaction in the taste of his sweet, fat little behind. In 1935, Fish was tried for the murder of several children, including Billy Gaffney. During his trial, Fish's defense team argued that he was insane, citing his deeply disturbed psychological state. Fish had a history of bizarre and perverse fetishes, including sadism, masochism, cannibalism, and necrophilia. His fascination with religious themes, such as the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac, led him to believe that sacrificing a child would atone for his sins. Despite the defense's claims of insanity, the jury declared Fish guilty, feeling that his crimes were so monstrous that he deserved the death penalty. Fish was sentenced to death by electrocution. On January 16, 1936, he was executed at Sing Sing Prison in New York. His death took longer than usual, reportedly taking 3 minutes to pass, which was much longer than the typical execution time. It was said that Fish helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body before his execution. Fish's childhood was marked by severe abuse and trauma. He was raised in a dysfunctional family and faced significant neglect and isolation. His early years were full of physical and emotional pain, and his experiences likely played a major role in shaping his later deviant behavior. His case serves as a tragic example of how childhood abuse and neglect can contribute to the development of a deeply disturbed individual. The gruesome details of Fish's crimes, particularly the murder and cannibalization of Billy Gaffney, shocked the nation and solidified Fish's place in criminal history. His trial and execution marked the end of a reign of terror, but his legacy lives on as one of the most disturbing serial killers in history. His case remains a chilling reminder of the horrors that can arise from untreated mental illness and childhood trauma.